Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Sean Welsh. I'm the programmer of Matchbox Cine Club, based in Glasgow, Scotland, and also one of the coordinators for Scalarama in Scotland. Today's event is a special spin-off from Scalarama Glasgow's regular monthly programme of roundtable events for independent exhibitors, leading into the annual September season of DIY film events. Anyone that's unfamiliar with Scalarama can find Scalarama Glasgow on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. These year-round events that we do are intended to bring film programmers together to share advice and resources, encourage collaboration, and provide a way for new and emerging programmers to benefit from that advice, those resources, and collaboration with their peers and established film programmers. Of course, there's a huge amount of uncertainty just now, and that's affecting everyone's plans, including any Scalarama program in September, and pretty much everything else people might have had lined up for 2020. On the other hand, taking things online means we have new opportunities too, one of which is talking with people from much further afield, which brings me to this event tonight and to our very special guest. Kier-La Janisse is a film writer and programmer with over 20 years experience and a ridiculously impressive CV. She founded the Cinema Muerta Horror Festival in Vancouver, where it ran for 6 years, and has subsequently worked with Fantasia, Fantastic Fest, Australia's Monster Fest, and many others worldwide, including Edinburgh's Dead by Dawn Festival. Kier-La also founded Blue Sunshine, a micro cinema in Montreal, was head programmer at the Alamo Drafthouse for 4 of its formative years, and serves on the advisory board of the American Genre Film Archive. In a parallel career as a writer, commentator, and publisher, Kier-La has written 2 books, including the landmark House of Psychotic Women, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, contributed to many more, and established the small press spectacular Optical to edit and publish anthologies on subjects like kid-centric cult classics, pop culture, Satanism in the 1980s, and Christmas-themed horror and television. Kier-La has also produced documentaries like Eurocrime, this is the end of my props by the way, and video content for the likes of Severin Films, who will also release her upcoming directorial debut, Woodland Stark and Days Bewitched, a history of folk horror. So this evening I'll be chatting with Kier-La for a while and then opening up the floor to our guests on the Zoom call. We're also streaming live to Facebook and we'll be keeping an eye on any questions posed there too. Thanks to Film Hub Scotland for their ongoing support and to iMedia, who are AI Media, we're never entirely sure how to say that properly, who are providing live subtitles tonight. So without further ado, all the way from a mystery and sunny location in Canada, please welcome Kier-La Janisse. How are you, Kier-La?
Hi, good, thanks.
Good to see you today. You don't seem like the kind of person who sits still for very long. How have you been coping recently?
I actually love it. I know it's not a popular opinion, but I love being by myself and I love being antisocial. And so it's like, I love going to film festivals and sort of getting all my social energy out at events like that. But I'm very much a hibernator who likes to be in my own cocoon. And so the fact that I can sort of go through this time without anyone bothering me about how antisocial I am I actually like that, you know, so I'm finding it fairly productive and calming and stuff.
That's great. So you are one of the people that are going to write their masterpiece. And
I hope so. We'll see. But I also realize I'm sort of in a privileged position because I didn't lose my job like so many other people. You know, my day job is working for Severin Films, and sure. And we are still in production as usual. So I realize I'm also very lucky that I have that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So I wanted to kind of talk about your secret origins, your career to date, and particularly your career as a film programmer. Obviously, you have a number of hats, and I'm sure they have kind of they're very connected in various ways rather than separate. But I wonder if you could just tell me your secret origins for film. How did you get into film? Your very first experiences of movies in the cinema.
Well, my first experience is something I've written about, but it's seeing the movie Horror Express when I was a kid. We would have these Saturday afternoon creature features on television. And I remember watching it at my grandmother's house when I was quite young. And it's one of my first memories, but it's definitely my first film memory. And I had nightmares about a character in that movie for like a decade after that. But in terms of it, you know, and so I became interested in horror films very young. I was really interested in monsters, especially. And my parents, especially, my parents were both like into different types of horror themselves. And my stepdad would cut out articles from the paper, and he would, wake me up late at night if there was a creature feature on, because they'd be on at midnight sometimes too. And so they really encouraged that interest, like they encouraged anything I did that I became kind of obsessive about. They really encouraged it. They didn't encourage it as like a job though, so making the transition into like working in film, that was something that came a lot later. I started going to university for something else. And it wasn't until I started my first film festival just as like a hobby that I realized like, oh, I can do this. This is something I can transition to. And I think that because I had always thought that in order for you to work in film, you had to make films. And I didn't really have that much of an interest in making films. I didn't know till I was older that there were all these other jobs related to film, like programming and film restoration and, library sciences, and just like so many other jobs that you can do in film, where I feel like if I had known that earlier, I probably would have gone to school for something like that, something like archival related to film. But yeah, that's sort of where it started. It was kind of a chance viewing of something on TV that blossomed into an interest that was then encouraged by parents. So.
And I've can sprinkle through some like vaguely stalkerish information that I've researched on you from various interviews and things. Is it true that as a child you watched The Breakfast Club 56 times for a bet?
I did. It was like a competition I had with a friend of mine in school, where I don't remember what grade I was in, like maybe grade 7 or something. And we just, she wanted us to have a bet to see who could watch their favorite teen movie, which I guess at that time that was my favorite teen movie. And so she watched The Outsiders however many times, and I won by watching The Breakfast Club 50 something times. So I don't like betting. I like I like making bets with people about stupid things. So so that was just one of those things.
I just wonder how many times she watched The Outsiders.
Well, I think it was close.
Okay. So you were studying something else at university. Was it a PhD? I think you're working. Is that right? No?
I wasn't. No, I was actually just doing my bachelor's degree in medical studies. I did read that somewhere, that somebody said I was a PhD student. I was like, that's okay, I'll take it.
And that's when you were kind of, I believe you were working in the video shop and you began working on this zine as well. Is that right? And that was the zine that eventually you took over, and then it eventually became Cinemuerta, the zine. Is that correct?
Yeah, so how it originally started was that I worked in this video shop, and there was a movie theater across the street and a cafe next to that, and all of the people who kind of worked at these places hung out at the cafe, and they all wanted to start like a zine, like a neighborhood zine or something. And I was the only person that was like, no way, I'm not doing anything for that. Like, I was too lazy, whatever, and I didn't want to do it. And everybody was like, let's meet in a week and we'll all have like an article that we wrote or something. And then it turned out a week later, I was the only one that had actually done anything. And I'm trying to think. So the zine was called, nobody had even thought of a name for it or anything. So I named it, and it was called Wombat Vengeance, which was from Rock and Roll High School Forever, the sequel to Rock and Roll High School. It's like at some point they're forming a band and they're trying to think of names for their band, and somebody yells out Wombat Vengeance. And for some reason I thought that was really funny. And so that became the name of my first zine, which was terrible, because really it was just like everyone in the neighborhood, no matter what they did, just throwing stuff in and it went in. There was no curating or anything like that. But because it seemed like I was paying for it and I was the only one actually organizing it, I was like, well, if I'm going to do this work, I'm just going to have a horror zine. Why would I have this neighborhood coffee zine, So instead, I just switched my energies to starting a zine that it was originally called Cannibal Culture. And again, I mean, I wish I had read more zines before I started that zine, because in retrospect, it's really bad. It's really bad. Like, does
it still exist?
Stuff. What's that?
Is it in your archive? You still have copies?
I don't have copies of all of them now. I cringe when I look at it. So, there was like an Italian issue. The second issue was like Italian horror, and every fact in it is wrong. So this was like before the internet, and it's like a lot of times what, you know, I was piecing together stuff I had read in various, you know, you know, I'd read Video Watchdog and European Trash Cinema and zines like that. But I just feel like I got so much information wrong, that it's embarrassing. But and just obnoxious, you know, my tone of my writing was so like obnoxious, and I hate it. Yeah. But it was like, that's kind of how it started, you know, it was like finding my voice. I sort of had to go through that period. So.
And so how did you get from the Cinema to Zine to what presumably was never called Wombat Vengeance Film Festival? Like, what was the steps to take you to that point?
It was because I was working in the video store, and I had the zine, and pretty much the only people that bought it were people that would come in the store. And there was this one annoying kid who came in one day and just started, he was like the kind of customer that every time he would come in, I would just go like, ugh, like he just sucks all the energy out of the room. But he was really into horror films. And so he was constantly like challenging me, and, you know, but so he said, well, you know, the zine, whatever, it's great, but it's like, but nobody can see the movies that you write about in it, because in Canada we have obligatory ratings like they do in the UK. So in America, you can just put whatever movie on the shelf you want, but in Canada, you can't ask to go through a distributor who then pays for it to be rated and has to get a rating that allows it to be on the shelf. And so for so many of the films I would write about, they didn't have Canadian distribution, so we couldn't have them at the store. But I would review them, and so this kid was like, how come you don't put on a film festival or something and play the films? Like, why don't you do anything to like get the films shown? And I was like, what can I do? I don't know how to do anything like that. And so I went, I feel like I've told this story so many times, so I apologize to anybody hearing it again. But I went to, there was a local micro cinema called the Blinding Light Cinema that I loved, had amazing programming that sort of straddled the line between like experimental film programming and like just weird cult film and stuff. And I went there with like a list of films, and I just told the owner, like, if you play any of these films, I can help you get an audience to come to them, type of thing. So I gave him the list, never heard from him, you know, months go by. And then he contacted me, I think in like January of whatever year it was, 1999, and said, okay, so I'm doing the June calendar. What dates do you want for your horror film festival? And I was like, I don't have a horror film festival. And he was like, oh, didn't you give me a list of films that you were going to play in a horror film festival? And he's like, I thought you wanted to like rent the theater and put on this festival. And I was like, well, no, how much is it to rent the theater? And it was $200 a night, which was even then cheap. And I had just gotten my student loan for school. And so I used it to put on the film festival. I was like, okay, I'll do that. You know, but of course the first year was like totally sketchy because I didn't know anything about booking films. So half the films I played were like VHS tapes of like PAL transfers, you know, so they were like dark, crappy with like Greek subtitles or whatever on them. And then the other half of the films were actually cleared because fortuitously in the months leading up to that first festival, I met these people named Chris Bavoda and Ashley Fester, who had just moved to Vancouver from Montreal, where they had been involved peripherally with the Fantasia Film Festival. So they knew Mitch Davis, the lead programmer there, knew, you know, a lot of the people associated with that festival, and had met filmmakers and stuff too. And they connected me to Mitch, and then between Mitch and other people Mitch connected me to, I was able to actually get permission for like half the films I wanted to show and get proper copies of them. So like half of them the first year were literally bootleg VHS tapes with Dutch or Greek subtitles. And, you know, but the other half of them, like I think I showed Necromantic maybe the first year, and that was, we got on 16mm and stuff and did it properly. But yeah, so that was it. And so it was like after that first festival, which broke even, you know, and it only broke even because I was playing half the films without permission. But then the second year I moved to a bigger venue and started getting into 35mm and stuff. And that's when things started to get very expensive because I was shipping prints in from all over the world and I had no context of what was a normal amount of money to be paying for things, you know.
Yeah.
And so I just had to kind of find out through trial and error what I could afford and what I couldn't, you know, because the FedEx bills would come in and I'd just be like, ugh, you know. But yeah, so it was like I just did it. I didn't know, you know, had never volunteered at a film festival or anything. I had no idea like the machinations of like how they work. So I just had to kind of do it and figure it out.
Right. And you all your own money on the line, and you were also taking care of programming, venue booking, print trafficking, marketing, guest services, like literally everything apart from, or presumably you had more help as years went on.
Yeah, I had friends that I would say for most of the year I would be doing it myself, and then for about a week or maybe 2 weeks before the festival, other friends of mine would sort of come on and be volunteers, where they would sign up to be like drivers, you know, kind of babysitting the guests or whatever, or dropping off programs or whatever, you know. So it'd be like, you know, in the last 2 weeks there would be people that would like come in and help a lot to make it actually happen, because I can't be in a million places at once. There's no way I could have done it totally by myself, you know.
Sure.
And then also the venues that I was at, the people who worked at those venues were really helpful also. So
yeah. I mean, it's quite, have you found it's quite an atypical way to come up and a way to run a film festival, because to wear all those hats and to essentially do it all yourself?
It is now, especially because it seems like people can go to school for film programming. Like they didn't have that when I was younger. Like now you can go to school for film programming, you can go to school for curating, and people sort of, there's a more clearly defined pathway now where people have like internships, you know, they volunteer, then they become an intern, and then, you know, and I feel like that's how a lot of people come up through it. But I also feel like when people do it that way, they are often disappointed. They're like, oh, I went through all this work and I didn't get this magical film programming job at the end of it, you know? And, you know, so I always tell people, it's like, because if somebody is going to hire you as a programmer, it's not just about your taste. It's about your network. It's about like the fact that you know what's at stake if that film doesn't perform well, you know, and that comes from being in that position of losing money and having to be in a half-empty theater with a guest there, you know, like going through those kinds of excruciating experiences are what help make you a better programmer, because it's such a balancing act, you know. But it's like everybody who just has good taste in movies thinks like, oh, I could be a film programmer because I have great taste, but that's only like part of the job, you know. And so I do feel that a lot of times having your own money on the line is a total game changer in terms of your perspective on what you're doing.
So it's really important.
Yeah, it's like people just expect to get a job as a film programmer and use someone else's money to play with. And it's like, why would anybody do that? Why would somebody just give you a budget out of nowhere, you know? So yeah, so I do feel like it was kind of atypical, but I feel like a lot of the people that I have become long-term friends with in the film programming community and stuff are people who started out kind of that way also.
Just basically determined to do it no matter what, and like, you know, making something happen that wouldn't happen otherwise.
Yeah, and I mean, even if it's things like, you know, you start screening movies in a bar, you know, where there's like noise infiltration and light infiltration and crappy presentation or whatever, but it's like people who just start off doing things like that, even it helps you get a sense of it, you know. It's to me, that's better than going the normal route of like being a volunteer and an assistant or whatever, you know. Just like
Sure.
do it yourself and like forge your own path and figure out how it works.
And I guess we kind of skipped a step because you were, I believe, hosting horror events in your basement before the festival itself. Is that right?
Yeah.
And you were cutting together programs from VHS.
Yeah, they were sort of like mixtapes, I guess. But they were actually very similar to like when the Alamo Drafthouse started doing their program of 100 Best Kills, you know, where they just have like a montage of like all these death scenes. And I think theirs are like edited together more tightly, you know, than mine were. Some of my clips would be quite long, but I was also making them VCR to VCR, you know, like I didn't have any editing, you know. I had 2 VCRs and you'd have to like keep redoing it because you didn't get it to start at the right time or whatever. And I don't even remember how to do that now, but I used to do everything that way, just like VCR to VCR. But so I would take all these like death scenes from different movies, and it would be like 2 hours long or something, or an hour and a half, and just invite people over. So it originally started where it was just my friends coming over, and then I just made posters and I just put them up, and like any weird stranger could like come into my apartment, and I had like a basement apartment, and people would just be crammed into it. My TV wasn't even that big, you know, but it was like, but that's I guess what Cinemuerte kind of grew out of, was doing, you know, I was always into finding ways to share the things I was interested in with other people. So.
And you always had that drive to do, you couldn't do something like casually and just watch it in your house. You had to kind of.
I always wonder why I can't do that. You know, I'm always like, why can't I just be a consumer? Like, why can't I just like watch the movies? Why do I have to like put on an event for other people and then have stress for the whole year and then have debt and like all these things? And, you know, but I think for a lot of film programmers, especially lifers, you know, it's a compulsion. It's like, you're just compelled to do this. And it's, you know, even when I try to quit, I'm like, okay, that's it. I'm not film programming anymore. And then I'll just think of some idea and, you know, I'll end up doing it again. But,
and you'll have to do it.
Yeah.
So when you were doing the cinema work and you were in the thick of it and wearing all those hats, was it difficult for you to give up any of those hats? And would you have ideally just done everything yourself? Like, I guess I can kind of relate to that level of obsession with making sure everything's right and making sure everything's taken care of. Was it ever tricky for you to kind of step away and let someone else get involved?
Not necessarily. I think I've always been a fairly good delegator, but I think that whenever I delegate things to people, they often feel like I'm just throwing them into the deep end. Like, I don't give them any help or instruction.
Right.
It's like, you're in charge of ticketing. And they're like, how does that work? What are ticket types or whatever? And I'm like, I don't know, figure it out. And so I've always been relatively okay with delegating. The biggest lesson for me, I think, was about programming, because when I first started programming the festival, you know, my dream was for me to just pick every movie, to be like in charge of a movie theater where I pick every movie, you know. And then after sort of doing the festival and also then going and doing the Alamo Draft House and stuff, I realized that having other voices in there is not only good for the programming, but it's also good for like the marketing and everything else, when it's like not you pushing your taste constantly. Like, you really do need those like other voices and those people who are going to be just as passionate about the stuff they programmed, and then they harass the press about their stuff so that the press isn't constantly being hit by the same person every day, you know. And so that part took me a bit longer, you know, because I thought like it just had to be about me and my taste, you know, and it's like, if I'm paying for the festival, it's going to be all movies that I pick, you know. And then I started realizing that, you know, you find the right people to, you know, that it's actually really amazing to bring in other people to help program stuff. So that was the part that was actually hardest for me to delegate.
And you must have had quite a learning curve with like the kind of esoteric aspects of festival, you know, promotion, like dealing with the press and marketing and all that stuff. That was challenging as well when you first started?
Well, I don't think I had barely any press for like all of Cinemuerte. And part of it was, I realized I was incredibly antagonistic towards the press, because I just thought, if you are a journalist, it's your job. Like, you have to cover this festival.
That's right.
You know? And so if they weren't covering it, I was like, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you doing your job? You know? And then it wasn't until I got to, so they just hated me, like the local press in Vancouver. But then when I got to work in Austin at the Draft House, and they would have these like meetings with the press where they would like, you know, just kind of like get the press really excited about stuff, and they would take them for drinks, and it was just more about like getting them on your side, you know, so that they get excited about the stuff you're into. And it was this totally different approach. I was like, wow, I've never thought of like giving a gift to a journalist. I just give them shit, you know, because I thought they owed me the press, you know, and that they weren't doing their job if they didn't do it. So all through Cinemuerte, I would say I failed at the press aspects of it. I failed at getting grant money for the same reasons. I was antagonistic towards the funders also, because I just thought like, you should be giving me money because I'm doing this. And I think if I'd even read one successful grant, I would have understood why I was not getting grants. Like just looking at the wording in how I was writing my grants, like, my festival is so great that you should be giving me money, and the grants that I later learned how to write were more about, like, especially when you're dealing with like arts funders, it's like downplaying the commercial viability of your project, because they want to hear about the how many independent artists you're supporting and all this stuff. They don't care how commercial it is. They don't care if you have famous people coming. It's more about, it's just they prioritize different things, and I didn't know that, and so I was also very antagonistic towards the funders. So it's like I learned that going from doing San Muerte to working at Alamo Drafthouse was like night and day in terms of like learning stuff from people who actually knew what they were doing.
Right.
I can't remember what the question was, or if I answered the question.
It's fine. We've got so many questions. So I guess we couldn't have missed another step there, just because I know that some people will be very interested. Like, how did you get from, you started your own film festival, ran it for 5 or 6 years, and then you started with working with Alamo Drafthouse, which is an entirely different country. It's not the same Alamo Drafthouse it is now, but because you were kind of part of their formative years. Yeah. So how did you make that transition into that job?
So I had been doing Sin Muerte, and so I started going to film festivals regularly. I would go to Fantasia every year. I would go to Sitges sometimes. I'd go to Dead by Dawn in Edinburgh, and it was one year at Sitges. Actually, how it happened earlier was that at the festival, Tim and Carrie Lee from the Alamo just showed up one year. So they flew up to Vancouver and came to the festival because we had a mutual friend in Anthony Timpson, who is a programmer in New Zealand, and programmer and print collector and filmmaker. I mean, he's another guy that's like a powerhouse, does everything. And so Anthony had said, like, oh, you should go and check out this festival up in Vancouver that's just kind of emerging. It's really cool or whatever. And so they just came up as customers. I didn't know them or anything. And they told me, they were like, wow, we're so impressed that you're just like running around and just doing everything yourself and stuff, And then I think that later that year, I was at the Sitges Film Festival. They had a spaghetti Western retrospective that was like massive that I wanted to go there for. And so, me and Anthony Timpson and Tim Lee were there, and we were all drinking, and Tim was like, you should come work for the Alamo Drafthouse. And I was like, what would I do? And he was just like, I don't know, we'll give you a job, slinging popcorn or whatever. He's like, it's just, we can always use people that have like that kind of energy where they really love that environment and whatever. So I was just like, no, I'm going to open my own cinema, so I don't want that job. And so I opened my own cinema. It failed within 3 months. It was like the biggest disaster ever. And that's another thing, learning the difference between festival programming and theatrical programming. Totally different, when you have to like keep that going all year, like a festival, you can blow all your money and you can be broke and it doesn't matter because you don't have to like do it again for a year. You have like the whole year to like pay it off or whatever. Mm-hmm. But when you're doing a theater, it's like you don't have that reprieve or that break. Like if you have to keep, it's like the debts just keep piling and piling and piling, So it's totally different. You have to program it different. You can't be spending like a shitload of money on shipping and prints from everywhere and stuff. Yeah. So I did that festival or that theater. It failed. And so then I called Tim back and I was like, okay, I want that job now. And he was like, what job? He had totally forgotten he had offered me this job. And he was like, oh, no, that's fine. Come on down. We'll find something for you to do. And so it was literally like, I just wanted to sort of get away from Vancouver and kind of lick my wounds a bit and stuff because I'd been so devastated by the failure of this theater. And so I just thought I'd go down there and just work behind the counter or be a server or sweep up or whatever. I didn't expect to get like an important job or anything like that. Mm-hmm. Just an average movie theater job. And then it turned out that the week I arrived was calendar time. So Alamo Drafthouse, the original Alamo on 409 Colorado Street in Austin, was a single screen venue. It ran on a calendar. So they didn't play first run movies. They played repertory and second run. Sure. And so it was calendar time, which meant everything had to get locked by a certain time because they had to go to print with the calendar. And there was a million holes in the calendar. Like Tim always did it himself. And he was like, okay, well, since you have experience doing this, you've booked films, you know, you've worked with studios and stuff, for this week, just help me finish the calendar. And then next week we'll train you on making the popcorn or whatever, you know? And, but then that week of like getting the calendar booked, and I even managed to repair a relationship that had soured between him and Paul Ginsberg, who was in charge of, he was the VP of repertory at Universal. And he was at a point where he was like, I am never renting a movie to Alamo Drafthouse again, because they were not, you know, they weren't submitting the right paperwork, weren't getting their box office reports in fast enough or whatever. And he was super annoyed, and he's like, didn't want to book them anything. And I managed to like repair that relationship in like the first day that I worked. But then Tim was just like, oh, that was so easy. He's like, I've never had someone help me do the program before. That was like so much better. I don't know if you can see. Can you see that bird that went by?
No,
okay.
Wow.
It was a bald eagle.
What?
Yeah.
Literally a bald eagle. Wow.
I see them every day. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, what was I saying? So yeah, so he just thought that he was like, wow, that was so useful having another programmer who could book films and stuff. He's like, I'm just going to keep you doing that. Is that okay? And I was like, yes, that's okay. And so then I became the first sort of regular full-time programmer there. There were people who, Lars Nilsson had been programming the Weird Wednesday series, but he was not actually an employee of Alamo Drafthouse. He worked other jobs, and then he just sort of did that on a volunteer basis, programming this weekly series. And then Henry Mazza was a server, and he had started programming, he had like specific ideas, specific shows he would pitch, and Tim would let him do. And Henry is now, he ended up becoming like the brand manager or some major executive at Alamo Drafthouse. But when I started, he was a waiter still. Right. But that's how much mobility there was there too. You know, like it was like, you know, if you had good ideas and you were dynamic, or, I mean, you could go from being like a chef to being an executive in like a year, you know? Wow. I think it's different now, because I think they recruit people in different ways now that are more like corporate and stuff. But yeah, so I ended up just doing that and being a programmer. And so then I worked side by side with Tim. I worked in his kitchen, because at that time there was no office for the Alamo Drafthouse. It was still just in his kitchen. And I lived on the next street over, so I would just walk to his house every morning, and then we'd just work in the kitchen all day. So.
And that's how you kind of cut your teeth in the cut and thrust of like cinema programming.
Yeah, so kind of my mentor, I guess. Him and Anthony Timpson were really my mentors.
I was going to say, did you have like, you know, even maybe not before Cinema Huerta, but like during it, did you have any hero programmers, or like, you know, before they took you under their wing, were there people that you looked up to as, you know, leading lights and the kind of what you could aspire to?
I'm trying to think, because I had it was such a new world to me, the whole idea of film programming. I don't think I knew that many film programmers, but I knew of Jack Stevenson, who was based in Denmark, I think. I think he lives in Copenhagen, and I don't know if he lived there then, but he, you know, he was like an American who sort of fell in love with Scandinavian cinema and stuff, and he was a film programmer I knew of for sure. And so, because he would travel around with, you know, 16mm prints and stuff, and show these rare films, and he sort of crossed, and he also wrote books, you know, so it was like I knew of him from his books that he wrote also, which talked about his, he wrote a book called Land of a Thousand Balconies that I think was out when I was doing my festival, and that was really influential to me. I'm trying to think of other I just don't even know if I knew what a film programmer was, you know, until I became one. But I think Jack Stevenson was like the only guy I really knew of that did that.
So this whole way, you're just kind of finding your own way and like picking up what you can, but just kind of powering forward. Well, I was going to ask you, maybe this is a more abstract question, but what do you look for in a film? Maybe even just for you personally, what does a film have to deliver before you say this is for me? Like how many minutes into a film you're like, this is my film?
It's funny because like it's making me think of the story where like I had to like, I don't know if it was like 5 years ago or something. At some point, I didn't work at the Alamo anymore, but Draft House Films, when Draft House Films was still operating, they needed like an extra pair of eyes, like just at the Cannes Film Festival, just scouting films and like taking meetings with people they didn't have time to meet with or whatever. And I remember meeting with this sales agent, and she was trying to show me all these films they had, and I was like, no, like that's not for us, you know. And she was like, well, what kind of films do you like, you know? And I said, well, you know, I tend to, like when I read film descriptions, I never read the actual description. I just sort of scan it for certain keywords of things that are like things I know that appeal to me. And she's like, oh, like what are some of the keywords? I was like, teenage prostitute, amputee, you know, listing all these things. And she was like horrified. And then I later went back and told the Draft House people, and they were like, you're not allowed to take meetings anymore.
Okay.
But I think like in general, like I really, like I definitely like grim movies. It's rare that I like a funny movie. I don't know if I don't think I'm a humorless person, but I definitely don't respond to most comedy that's designed as comedy and supposed to make you laugh. You know, like a lot of it, I have no response to. So I like really depressing movies. If it's really, really bleak and grim, I like it. Like I love like the Golden Glove, you know, like just total squalor, you know. And I love depressing movies, sad movies. I don't know, it's weird because it's like, you know, with horror, it's the frightening aspects or terrifying aspects of the movies usually are not the things I even respond to. You know, like with horror, it's often grief or something like that I'm responding to. But I also, you know, I'm very interested in like music film, you know, so like music documentaries, but also narrative music film. So there was a festival that I don't know if it was like, I think I already was working at the Draft House maybe when it started, or maybe it was kind of in the tail end of working at Cine Muerte that I heard of it, was that called Mods and Rockers. It was annual festival at the Egyptian, the American Cinematheque in LA, called Mods and Rockers. And it was all like 60s and 70s music films. And so some of them were documentaries and some of them would be like, you know, the Dave Clark 5 movie or whatever, where it's like directed by John Gorman and it's like the band in a narrative story. That festival, I would just salivate over their program every year. Another thing I remember, other programmers that I did know of before I worked at Draft House, was the Warepad in San Francisco. The Warepad was a micro cinema run by Scott Moffat, some film collectors, Scott Moffat, Jacques Poirot, I think Vicky Vaden, who is she's like mostly a DJ and stuff, and another guy whose name I can't remember, but so they ran and lived in this micro cinema space, which is common. I think a lot of micro cinemas, people live there too. And it ran for many years. It had like a pretty long life for a micro cinema. And then it later transitioned into a place called the Vortex Room.
But yeah, I know that. I know of that. I know that one.
Yeah, so Scott Moffat with the Warepad, like him and Jacques Poirot kind of split. Jacques moved to Portland and Scott stayed in San Francisco. So Scott moved to a different location and renamed the place the Vortex Room. But it was just great because it was, you know, they had amazing repertory programming and double bills, but they also were very into like cocktails and stuff, you know, cocktail culture. And so the whole vibe of the room was very important, you know, like the atmosphere, the social atmosphere. And so that was pretty influential on me also in the early years.
And was that a direct inspiration for Blue Sunshine, the Warepad, or was that before?
It was close. I'm trying to think if there were other micro cinemas that were more of an inspiration, but I think the Warepad, I mean, we did not achieve what the Warepad did. We were not around as long. Our vibe was not as cool as theirs, but yeah, that was definitely one of our big influences.
Because you had the Blue Sunshine, if we haven't explained already, was the micro cinema you had in Montreal, and you guys actually lived in rooms behind the screen. That was the kind of setup, wasn't it?
Yeah, and most people didn't know we lived there. You know, it was sort of, it was the third floor of an office building, and so it was an office building, so it had like pretty low ceilings for cinema. The sight lines were shit, but we had like the screen, which was an automatic kind of like roll downs. It was like the screen would come down, and then we had made masking for the sides, like just black velvet curtains, right, that we could adjust so that we could adjust the masking. And then we had skirting to put on the bottom of it, right, because the screen itself would stop halfway through the room. It wouldn't go down to the floor. It would stop halfway through the room. So then we had black skirting with Velcro that we would just go like attach the skirt to the bottom of the screen, and then it would look totally closed off, And so behind that curtain, we had our office where we worked at our computers, and then beyond the office was our 2 bedrooms, my partner and I, and my business partner. And yeah, most people who came in, they just thought that where the screen was, that was the front of the room. They didn't know that there was like these other rooms behind it. And it was it was an interesting apartment because people, like a lot of people who came in there were like, I've been here before. Like some other business had been there that, they'd gone there for. And at some point in the 80s, it had been the apartment of the band Men Without Hats, who was singing that song, The Safety Dance. So it was their apartment. So those are the 2 most famous things I think that have happened at that apartment, is Men Without Hats and us.
Did you feel their spirit when you're
I think
so? So yeah, I wanted to ask you, I have 5,000 questions incidentally, so I'll skip through some. I wanted to ask you about audiences and what you think about audiences. Do you have an imagined audience when you program films? Is it important to you to imagine them, or are you reactive like that to the audience you're playing to?
I used to have like expectations in terms of my ideal audience, and I would get really angry when they weren't like my ideal audience, like I felt like people didn't get things. I mean, especially in the early years of Cinemuerte, people would complain about the movies. I mean, they would complain about Deep Red not being a horror movie.
Right.
They would complain. I played Possession the first year of my festival. Everyone hated it. I mean, really, the fact that you can go on Facebook and see as many Possession memes as like Star Wars memes, to me is insane, because like people hated that movie. Like it's like people now, they don't realize, like it's like, where is all this love for Possession coming from? Because everyone hated that movie from the time it came out until like 10 years ago or whatever. So it's been really weird to see stuff like that, people completely turning around their opinions about, and Jean Rollin as a filmmaker, another thing where people just suddenly got very into him, and people hated his movies when he was alive. And but so I would get very frustrated with the audience because I felt like they weren't getting my programming, and over time I just stopped being that mad about it. And I think part of it was, like I said, bringing in other programmers, working with other programmers, because sharing, it can be very depressing to be programming by yourself and have people not get into your programming. It can really make you like question your self-worth and horrible. But at least when you have like other people who are kind of committed as much as you are and are sharing that energy, you kind of lift each other up, and you feel it's less personal, when the audience isn't responding to the stuff you program, And then there was things like at Blue Sunshine, we played, we had themed nights kind of. So it was like every Thursday night, we were open 4 days a week. Wednesday, we had Miskatonic Institute classes. So that was like the horror school I started. So we had those classes every Wednesday. And then Thursday, we played music movies. Friday was like cult and horror movies, and it was 99% of the time on 16 millimeter. So it was almost always on film. And then Saturdays tended to be experimental and animation, but that would sometimes be preempted by like an opportunity to have a special guest that was coming in from out of town or something. Like they would often get that slot. But the Friday night cult and horror nights and stuff, we just found that people were really in love with the idea of 16 millimeter. You know, it was like they just wanted to come and see anything on film. And we realized that we could satisfy the film people with small gauge, with 16 millimeter. You know, it didn't need, because we didn't have a big enough space for 35 millimeter to have all the proper ventilation and everything like that. And so our film had to be small gauge. And we found that all the like film purists and stuff were fine with that. So all the like kinds of people that now buy all the Severin releases and buy all the Vinegar Syndrome releases and Arrow releases and stuff like that, like all those types of people would come religiously on Friday night. So our Friday night was like always really well. And also by that time, it was like people had totally come around to certain directors and stuff and certain types of horror films that they didn't like a decade earlier, you know, like even British horror. I mean, like I remember a time where people just thought British horror was boring, you know, like even, God, I just remember like people even 5 years ago in the States complaining about how boring Blood on Satan's Claw is, you know? And now it's like, everybody's like, that movie is an essential film, you know, it's a canonical film. But yeah, so it's interesting to see like how, but I think like a lot of those DVD labels, it validates a lot of those films, right? It's like once that stamp is on it of Severin or Vinegar Syndrome or Arrow or whatever, it's like people already feel like it has this endorsement, and so they're willing to, you know, to go there.
Yeah, it's canonical now.
Yeah. But when you're just an independent programmer programming stuff like that, and it doesn't have that kind of endorsement, it's like a movie that's still not out on DVD or something and nobody's heard of it, you still face that resistance, I think, from a lot of the audiences where they're like, well, I don't know, I haven't heard of this. Whereas I'm the opposite. As a film goer, I'm way more likely to go to something if I haven't heard of it. Sure. Than something I've heard of. So.
So you talk about like Jean Rollin and like you know, Possession and things like in their kind of critical reappreciation or resurgence, like in slightly abstract terms, but you must be able to take some kind of credit for that stuff. You know, like the fact that you were programming Possession and, you know, Blood and Satan's Claw then and now, these are way more like acceptable or canonical films. Do you feel
I don't know if like credit is the right word, because I don't know if it's like because of me programming those movies that they became popular now. I feel vindicated for sure because of it. But I think there were other programmers I knew who were playing stuff like that.
Sure.
But they're kind of scattered around the world, you know, so there'd be like 5 programmers that I knew that were playing that type of stuff, but they'd be like in New Zealand and you know, somewhere in the UK and just like spread all over, you know, whereas now those films are so much more known and much more common and exist in formats that, you know, are accessible to most cinemas and stuff. So, you know, and I think DCP has actually changed that a lot too. I think DCP being such a portable format that's like so much cheaper to ship around, and a lot of times they don't even ship them anymore. Now they just download them.
Yeah.
But that, I think, made a lot of programmers become a lot more, like take more risks. So I feel as though, you know, ironically, we're in like this COVID time where everything has shut down, but I would say the last like four years or so, I mean, certainly since AGFA started doing like really pushing theatrical, I think that, you know, we've seen movies get screened in places where we're just like, you couldn't even imagine like a major city being able to drum up an audience for this weirdo movie, and now they're playing it like in some small cinema in Iowa is like booking, you know, Robo War or whatever. I don't know, like. Yeah. like weird Italian 80s action movies and stuff. it's just weird. I think like that the programming landscape changed a lot by DCP, and like it not being so expensive to take that chance.
Sure.
I don't know how I got there from what you read.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point, especially in the COVID context. Like, we can obviously see weird weekend programming and Terror Tuesday programming here now, whereas we'd have to wait until we could maybe screen one of those films. And
Right.
so that's really interesting. But I wonder how you feel about that in terms of the difference between sharing a film with an audience and being there with them to experience it in the room. I mean, in terms of, the comparison between evangelizing for a film and actually be able to show it to a physical audience.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like if you're in a room showing a movie like Toys Are Not for Children to people or something, and you feel the audience responding to that movie, nothing beats it, It's like the same as like musicians talking about like performing and being on stage and how they get high from the energy of the audience. It's very similar for film programmers. If you have a program that is working and it's like you can see the response the audience has. And obviously with streaming and everything, it's like it's cool that like you can have these viewing parties online, and people can kind of comment, so there's still a way for it to feel social and participatory and stuff. But I do hope that it doesn't become like where people are just like, oh, we'll just keep doing it like this, like after COVID is over, because this, it works well enough and it's easy. I really hope that things go back to, people going to cinemas and sharing that experience, because it's just a totally different vibe, like being in the room with all that energy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You've
I'm
always
just saying, like going to see a band versus watching it on TV. It's like, sure, you probably get a better view of the band watching it on TV, but it's a totally different feeling going to see them,
of course,
in a show,
Yeah. And I was going to ask, like, you've always, like, I mean, maybe over deliver is the right word for your events. I mean, you giving away gifts and like prizes and like, just extra stuff for screenings, and that's important for you as well, I think.
Yeah, although it's much more normal now. I think like it's so all those sort of bells and whistles like attached to screenings became really important once. I mean, that's part of like why the Alamo Drafthouse succeeded when people were saying like, oh, theaters are dying, everywhere. It's because they did that for every movie. I mean, when we would have programming meetings, I mean, yes, I would do it for Cinemuerte. Like I thought of doing that kind of thing just because like I always have these like just dumb ideas. Like when I did Cinemuerte, like cannibal holocausticals, I made these things called cannibal holocausticals that were made out of resin, and it was like the woman impaled on the stick, and it was like it didn't do anything. It was just like a little statue, and it wasn't. And I think I wanted it to actually be a popsicle at first, which is why it was called the cannibal holocaustical, but we couldn't figure out how to make the mold for a popsicle or something like that, and so we just ended up making them as little statues. And then giving out, we played Blue Sunshine with Jeff Lieberman there, and had like little baggies that were like supposedly had like 2 tabs of acid in it or whatever, and Jeff Lieberman autographed them all and stuff. And yeah, I love doing stuff like that. But when I worked with the Alamo Drafthouse, we would have our programming meetings every Wednesday, and everybody would be just throwing those ideas out. So it was like, first of all, having ideas for like what movies should we play. But then once we had kind of decided what the movies would be, then the meetings would be like, okay, what stupid things are we going to do to like tie into this movie to make it more exciting? Because that was ultimately why people came to the Drafthouse, to see movies, as opposed to just renting them or going to see second run films at another theater, And we had alcohol, which at that time no other theater in town had. So when they first started, it was hard for them to get studios to take them seriously and give book films to them. But then I think after only a couple of years, the studios started to see from the box office numbers that when they released a first run movie in Austin, they found that the movie did better in second run because people would wait to go see it at the Alamo Drafthouse because they could beer with the movie. And so once they saw that happening, then they started like offering those movies to the Drafthouse first.
Sure.
But it took a while. They had to sort of earn the trust because they were like these 2 kids, Tim and Carrie, just starting a movie theater in, people just thought it was like an impossible idea and that it was never going to work, and they didn't have any real like movie connections, like, they didn't have like a big network or anything. So they also were sort of just starting without knowing what they were doing totally.
So kindred spirits.
Yeah.
So there was a couple of key screenings that I wanted to ask you about that you again over delivered or came through in stunning style. The first one was, there was a situation, I think it was with Cinemorty, where you were delivered a print that was not subtitled.
Yes.
What film was that?
Black Belly Tarantula.
And what did you do about it?
So what did I do? We had the print, and obviously, when you're doing a festival, this has to be planned. They don't send you the print way in advance, so you're often having to deal with these problems at the last minute. But so I had a VHS of the movie, like a bootleg VHS of the movie, and it wasn't good enough to show or instead of the print or anything like that. But it was, I'm trying to think if it was dubbed or subtitled. It might have been dubbed. But so we had a little TV that we set up at the back of the cinema with like headphones, and we rented a PA system. So we had like these 2 additional speakers put at the front of the room attached to microphones. And we were like, okay, we are going to like watch the movie on the TV and do the voices live. So we have to like somehow sync this VHS to the print, which turned out was running at a completely different speed. And so Anthony Timpson was on the remote control, constantly rewinding and fast forwarding the movie to try to get it like in sync with the print. And then Udo Kier was the guest at the festival that year, and he wanted to do Giancarlo Giannini's voice in the movie. So it was like, so he was there. It was like Udo and me doing all the women's voices, I think. And then my friend Kelly Salerno, who was like a local actor in Vancouver. And so the 3 of us doing the voices, and then Anthony Timpson on the floor with the remote. And it was ridiculous because it was like, we had the headphones on, the movie's moving at a different speed, and we're looking at the TV here, but the screen is like here. So we're constantly like going like this, like trying to see where we are in the movie to make sure we're saying the line at the right time. It was ridiculous. But people who were there, it was like a Jallo night. I'm trying to think of what else played. I think like maybe one on top of the other. And I don't remember what, but I think it was like a Jallo triple bill that night. And yeah, so it was insane, but people loved it. Anybody who missed it was, because at that time also, that whenever I would do Jallo films, almost no one came. No one understood what that genre was. They didn't get into those films because there wasn't enough, like they didn't think they were like horror enough. It's crazy to think of now, but they were just like, this is just like a drama or something, and so but anybody who missed it was just sort of like, oh man, I can't believe I missed out on Udo Kier doing like a live voice to Black Belly of the Tarantula. But yeah, that's pretty cool. And it came in handy because that happened again times down the road. And we were like, well, we've done it before, we can do it again. So I had to do the same thing a couple of years later when I played the movie Airport, and Airport arrived, like the print in Italian.
Oh, right. Wow.
And that was like a 2.5-hour movie. And back then there was no, you could order a script of the movie, but it would take like 2 weeks to get it in the mail, and
Right,
I only days. There was like, it wasn't like now where you can just download the PDF or whatever. You had to like get the thing mailed to you. And so I've watched like a VHS of Airport and like hand wrote all of the dialogue in the movie and then typed it out, which took me like 30 hours or something. And then I, got the PA, got the people to do the different voices, and there was more of us doing the voices than there were people in the theater watching.
That's devotion for you. That's devotion for you.
Yeah.
Dedication to the cause. That's amazing. So like, yeah, the other one I wanted to ask you about, and obviously, please feel free if you've got any more horror stories or success stories. But there was one that stood out, which is when you screened Until the Light Takes Us in Winnipeg,
Oh yeah. Hmm.
and you had a unique setup for that special event, which I
Yes.
guess the film came first before the idea for the setup. Is that right?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
the film was out and I really wanted to play it. And they didn't want to give it to me because, so this was after I had left the Alamo Draft House. I'd gone back to Canada. I worked for a year at the Winnipeg Film Group programming. And then I quit that job and I just started doing independent events. So I already had this website called Big Smash because I had done this like short music. I'd done this music festival in Vancouver for like 1 year called Big Smash. And it was like music documentaries and stuff like that. And that was a total failure. I mean, all the movies were amazing, but it was a failure financially. But I already had the website built. So I was just like, well, I'm just going to change. I'm just going to start some totally different thing and call it Big Smash and I can use the website. And so I just started doing independent events. And so I would do them probably like once a month, sometimes twice a month in Winnipeg. And so the movie Until the Light Takes Us, black metal documentary, was coming out. And I'd been following it as it was in production. And I was like, talking to the filmmakers and I was just like, I want this movie. I want to play this movie. But I was just like an individual person. You know, it's like for any distributor to just be like, why would I give you the movie? Like, I want to get it in a movie theater, you know, like why am I going to give it to some no-name individual person? But so I kept promising that I was going to do something special. I was like, if you give me this movie, I'm going to do something no one will do for it anywhere in the world. I will be the only one to do this. And they were like, well, what is your idea? And I was like, I want to project it on a screen made out of snow in the middle of winter and have everybody outside freezing their asses off watching it on this screen made out of snow. And so eventually they gave me the movie. And so I had to set about making the snow screen, which is, you know, we have a lot of snow in Winnipeg. So like coming up with snow wasn't a problem, but there's other things you just don't think about where if you were to just take snow from the ground, it's going to have like leaves and dirt and like all kinds of stuff in it. So it turned out that there was a guy who was like in charge of the film commission in Winnipeg that I had worked with as a teenager at some costume shop I used to work at as a teenager. And he was now like the head of the film commission. So he was the person who would like arrange for filming permits in Winnipeg and stuff. So I contacted him and he said, you know, I can get you fresh snow delivered. And I was like, great. So what he did was he was like, the snow plows go around every morning and they get all the brand new snow off the road. So what we can do is we can get it delivered to the place where you need it. I was like, great. So but I also had to have a place that was like enclosed because the thing is you have to have the screen has to like set, right? It has to harden when you build it. So you have to leave it kind of like for a week for it to be hard enough. But the problem is if you just have it in a park or whatever, some kids are going to come and kick it over, you know? So you have to have it like protected somehow. So I found like a pub that had like an outdoor courtyard.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, so we're going to do the screening in there because then it's protected because no one could get in that courtyard.
And just to clarify, you didn't know how to build a screen made of snow before you started?
No.
No.
No, I promised this without having any idea how I was going to do it logistically.
Right. That's right.
There's also other issues related to the weather, like, you know, having a expensive video projector outside in the freezing cold.
Yeah.
And how long is that going to work before everything freezes up and power stops working and all that? So those things were considerations too. So, so we had this pub, we had the snow delivered there, and then this, two people kind of worked on the snow screen. So the main person who built it was this guy named Ricardo Alms, he was like a production designer on a bunch of Guy Madden's movies. So he basically built the snow screen and he built like a wooden frame first and then took all this fresh snow and dumped it into the frame and like packed it in. And then at the end of the week, he came and he took the frame off, like the boards, like just unattached everything. And then the snow screen was there. And then this other woman, Andrea, that I knew, came and carved. She was a sculptor, and so she came and carved the name of the movie into the top of the snow screen.
Wow.
And, so it was, and then people came in snowsuits and corpse paint, you know, and like sat outside in the winter in Winnipeg watching this movie. And we had to have the projector wrapped in like thermal blankets, and we had all the cords going through this like special thermally protected piping and stuff, you know. So yeah, it was the whole time like I was just waiting for, and actually we did lose power. We lost power like in the first 5 minutes of the movie. Everything went and but we got it back up and running, and it ran for the whole rest of the movie.
Wow.
So, yeah, but that was that was a big one.
That's extremely
one of my
cool.
proud moments.
Yeah. And I think you made loads of money on that.
I did not make loads of money on that. Luckily I didn't pay that much either, though, you know.
Okay.
Like I think I paid a flat fee for the thing, and a lot of the people that worked on the screen and everything like just did it all volunteer. I think I may have paid Ricardo Alms like $200 or something, something like that, to like make the screen. And then, but the other one that I really liked that I put on was I played Deep End, the movie Deep End, in a pool with the audience in a pool.
Right. Wow.
And that was complicated too, because, you know, logistically you're like, you have all this electrical equipment around.
Also, it's like a pool with water in it. An actual,
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So everybody's in the pool, in the water, like floating, right, watching Deep End. And, you know, but it was like in an indoor pool, because we had to be able to control the, you know, actually, I think the reason we had to do it in the indoor pool was because we had to get a private pool, because the city wouldn't let us use any of the public outdoor pools for liability reasons. And so we had to go like a private pool in like a hotel that was willing to take the liability risk. But we had all this electronic gear like all around the pool, and all the people in the pool watching it. And my friend was like, "How come you're not going in the pool?" I was like, "There's no way I'm going in that pool with all that electric." I was just waiting for everybody to get electrocuted the whole time. But luckily that didn't happen.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that didn't happen. Okay, so it's probably about time that we open up to some other people to ask some questions. So if everyone else is that's sitting on the call just now, if you want to like switch on your video, maybe stay muted for the minute. If you're all still there, I'll kind of watch out for you popping up. And if you want to stick your hand up if you have a question ready, and I'll just jump to you. So who wants to be first? Or Sam May, switch on your audio and ask a question.
Yeah, sure. So I have a question more about your like interest in like folk horror. Like I know you're making a documentary on folk horror, and I was just wondering, what's your sort of like thoughts about the more modern like iterations of folk horror? So like stuff like Ben Wheatley's films or The Witch. Like, do you still have that sort of same interest in that level of folk horror?
Oh no, definitely. I mean, like the and the thing to clarify about the movie is that a lot of the people in the movie who I interview, they are more the experts in folk horror than me. You know, it's kind of like I knew it was like a topic that bore exploring, and so so just to let you know, they're way more folk horror experts than me. But absolutely, the last 10 years of folk horror is, I mean, that's kind of like the epilogue of the movie, is this whole resurgence in folk horror, and then looking at things that have happened politically that are very similar to things that happened in the early 1970s when the first wave of folk horror kind of became popular. But the movie also goes like a lot into international folk horror too, you know. So it's like, it started off when I started making it, it was just going to be a bonus feature for Severin to go with Blood on Satan's Claw. And then when I started putting it together and I handed it in, it was like 2 hours long. My rough cut was 2 hours long, so it was longer than Blood on Satan's Claw. And so then they were just like, oh, well, instead of cutting it shorter, why don't you just like keep going, like interview more people and try to make it into a feature instead. And, so then once we started talking to people, it was, originally very focused on British folk horror because it was connected to Blood on Satan's Claw. But then when we opened it up internationally, it became really interesting because like the way that people look at folk horror and how they define it is so different in cultures, especially where they were not colonial cultures, you know? So it's like if you have, it's like a lot of the folk horror to like British people, Americans, Australians, people who came and like colonized a place, you know, have a very specific type of folk horror. And then when you get into like the Pacific Rim and stuff like that, you just have a totally, like they look at folk horror as much more, it's different because it's like a lot of those older beliefs are not considered older beliefs to them. They're considered current beliefs, you know? So it's like the whole idea of British folk horror where there's this older culture that's constantly in conflict with the modern, you know? That doesn't exist in the same way in folk horror coming from a lot of different countries, because for a lot of other countries, it's like those religions and those spiritual practices are still current and still, you know, the dominant belief systems and stuff. And so yeah, so we started looking, so I mean, it's like massive. Right now it's 5 hours long. So it's like I have to somehow get it to a normal length. But it's, yeah, there's so much interesting stuff in it. But all of that, all of the new stuff is definitely covered. So, cool. But it focuses more on like specific ideas. So it goes through specific ideas and then brings in specific films as they sort of illustrate those ideas. So it's not like covering every single film, you know? So there's definitely going to be like films that are just not mentioned because there's another film that illustrates that point better or whatever. So yeah, it doesn't go through like, because there's so many films. I mean, we have over 200 films in it that people talk about. So it's like, you can't just go through like film by film by film, breaking each one down, you know? So we sort of had to pick like specific ideas and specific themes and then bring in the films as they kind of relate to those ideas.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Prano, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering how you found the transition from programmer to filmmaker, and if you see that kind of moving into the narrative space as well as documentary.
It's weird because I still don't consider myself a filmmaker. I mean, I haven't, I think like I got involved with like any sort of filmmaking I do, which is mostly just working for Severin doing extras and stuff. Most of that is mostly because of my network. Like, because I have access to people because of my programming background. So there'll be like filmmakers that he'll want to interview, or he being David Gregory, who owns Severin, filmmakers that he'll want to get for bonus features. And it's like, I just happen to be well positioned to set that up or sort of produce those bonus features because I know a lot of people from all these years of film programming. But I don't necessarily like want to be, even making the folk horror movie, I wish I could just be the producer of it. I became the director of it by accident because basically I was the editor of it and the producer, which is like for how we do bonus features. We don't normally credit a director. It's normally just like the producer, and then whoever edits it is kind of the director, I guess, you know? And so when it came time, you know, when we decided that we were making a feature out of the folk horror movie, and we had to list a director somewhere, we were just like, well, who's the director? And David was like, you're the director. And I was like, I don't want to be a like I don't think I don't have the skills that I would consider, you know, important for a director. I'm much more of like a producery person where it's like I can think of like pieces or even think of like people that would work well together and put them together, but I didn't necessarily want to be the director. So, and I still feel like somebody could probably direct this movie way better than me. But you know, but I'm learning. By the end of that process, who knows, that may change. But I still feel like I don't think I'm gonna like transition into like filmmaking. So.
Okay, Doc, who has a question next? Anna, sorry, Anna, you're hidden on my screen. Anna, do you want to go?
Yeah.
Hello.
Hiya. I was actually wondering something I've been thinking about pretty much since the moment I started programming myself as well. How do you keep a record or an archive of all of your programming endeavors? And like, because when you think about it, kind of programming is so ephemeral. You know, you do it and you put all of this time and this effort into it, all the blood, sweat, and tears and money, and that connection with the audience when it happens, and even when it doesn't, and those beautiful disasters that can happen are great. But how do you archive that so that other people can learn, or even attribute and give credit to, you know, the resurgence of a particular filmmaker, or screening something for the first time, or even, you know, that screening that you described before?
Yeah, it's weird because archiving and documenting my events has always been my weak point. You know, it's like other people have better collections of like my old programs and stuff than I do. Yeah, and even for on internet, even like once, you know, the internet became a thing and websites became a thing, it's been hard enough to keep those archives because of websites getting old. Like I had this website that was like the big smash website, and when I did all of my kind of independent ones for a certain period of time, they would all be on there. And then recently, like just like a month ago, my web host got in touch with me and was like, we're upgrading all of our stuff or whatever, and that website is too old. Like it can't exist anymore. Like you have to get everything off of it if you want to keep it, type of thing. And so I had to sort of go through, and it was like I had to manually take stuff off of it, but I was like, where do I put it? Where does it now live online? You know, so so I had to like move it to my Spectacular Optical website, which is like a totally different business. It's like my publishing website, but just so that it still exists there. If anyone Googles something, it's there, right? So I just added these events manually to that website, because even that, like websites getting old and going defunct. And even like when you program for other theaters, like the Cine Family in LA is like a perfect example of like, you know, they just took down their Vimeo. So like all of the independent editors who had like volunteered and made these amazing trailers for their programs, including the one for my House of Psychotic Women series, you know, like all that stuff is just gone, you know. And so it's like when it's same with journalists, you know, like when you writing and then all of a sudden that newspaper folds or whatever, and then all their archives are just gone, and it's like you don't have a record of your pieces and stuff. So it's like, yeah, trying to be vigilant about like maintaining archives of your own stuff, and then having like camera people filming events. Like even my Miskatonic classes, we rarely have people film them, you know, but it's also, we can't afford it, you know, because it's like paying someone like £100 or £200 or whatever to show up and record this class. It's like, we don't even make enough money at the class to pay that, you know? So archiving often becomes the first thing to not be prioritized. So yeah, so I don't have any good advice for it because I'm terrible at it. And I feel like it's a struggle for me also. Like, I feel like so much of my history just doesn't exist anywhere, like other than in my brain and my storytelling, you know, like it's like, there's no record of all these things that I've done unless I tell people about it myself. So, yeah.
I have a tangential question to that, which kind of Anna touched upon, and I think you've talked about it a wee bit before, in terms of where you've worked before and who you've worked with, like the ethics of the film programmer, like, you know, how you kind of, you know, make sure that you pay tribute to somebody that's inspired you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, this is something that sticks in my craw quite a bit, actually, because, and I'm glad you talked about there being a programmer's ethic, because when I talk about it, people think I'm like being pretentious or something. And I'm like, no, there are ethics to this behavior. You know, we're all like working in the same field, and and programmers often don't make a lot of money, and their ideas are their currency, you know? And so it's like, if another programmer has this idea to do something, and you're like, oh man, that's such a cool idea, I would love to do that at my cinema. Then you contact that person, you say that you want to do something like that at your cinema, see how you can collaborate or whatever. You don't just like copy it, you know, and not acknowledge where you got the idea. And that has happened with, like, I started this thing in 2003, I guess, called the Saturday Morning All You Can Eat Cereal Cartoon Party. And as far as I know, still, I'm the originator of this. Like, I was the first person to do it in a theater. I was inspired by another friend of mine who like did a similar kind of thing at his house for his birthday, where he had like, you know, he just showed cartoons for the whole morning and had a table with like a bunch of cereal on it. And it was like 10 people that came over for his birthday and did this. And I got the idea from that and then brought it to like an actual theatrical environment for the first time. But I went a bit further because I added commercials in between everything, all the cartoons. I added like station identifications before everything, public service announcements. Like, I tried to create the whole like package. And then there would be like a buffet of, you know, sometimes 60 different kinds of sugar cereal. I know in the UK, you guys don't have that many. You guys have like 6 kinds of sugar cereal or something.
Yeah.
Something sad like that. But
Mostly Weetabix, that's pretty much as exotic as it gets.
Yeah, but yeah, so in America, there's a lot of sugar cereal. And so when you do them, especially in America, there's like tons of cereals you can get. And so I started doing this. And then when I started working at the Alamo Draft House, I brought it there and started doing it there. And then other programmers started copying it, and they didn't think they were copying me. They thought they were copying the Alamo Draft House, but they didn't credit the Alamo Draft House either, you know? So it was like programmers now all over the world do this. And I've even had programmers who've like booked the show from me, you know, paid me the minimal amount of money I charge for it, which is like nothing. And then sort of glean the format from booking it one time, and then they never contact me again, and they just start copying it, you know? So it's like they can't even claim ignorance as to where it came from because they booked it from me the first time. And that kind of thing just drives me nuts. I was like, does it not, like, it was like, what, you know? It just seemed like when I first started programming, I felt like nobody would do that to another programmer. Like, they would always like credit, they'd be like excited to credit other programmers, like, and like talk about these other great programmers, you know? And it just seems like now people just, you know, they just see an idea at any theater and they just take it and copy it. And obviously some people get inspired, and so they do things that are kind of similar but not totally the same. But some of them are like blatantly like just completely ripping off something that, you know, you originated. And I just think, yeah, it's like you should just contact those people and just say like, I would really love to do this. Like, is there a way that I can do this and like credit you for the idea or anything like that? And just see, most of the times the programmers will just be so stoked that you acknowledged them. You know, it's not like they're gonna want money for it usually or anything. It's like often they're just like, wow, some acknowledgement, that's great. And so, yeah, I just wish that people did that more. I mean, I find even with writing, you know, I mean, I feel like there are women who write article versions of my House of Psychotic Women book, like all the time. And they never mention the book at all. And it's like, you know, I'm like a starving author. I don't make a lot of money. I make a really low percentage. Selling a book every once in a while would be great. Like if you got that idea from reading my book, maybe just mention it in the article and then it would help me a lot. But so I find that weird, you know, and it's, yeah.
There's
But I don't know
really
what
an answer.
you look like an asshole when you say it to people. When you go to someone, you say like, you know, can I get credit for that thing or whatever? You look like the asshole. So it's like you're put in this weird position.
I guess all you can do is kind of lead by example in a way.
Yeah.
I'm not sure there's a good answer for it. So I have some follow-up questions to that, but I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to ask a question. So who would like to go next? Becky. Becky, are you ready to ask a question?
I am, yeah, sorry, I was just finding my unmute button.
All right, sorry.
Kier-La, hi. You talked so excitedly about DVD releases from companies like Arrow and Vinegar Syndrome. And I wondered if you had like a dream title or titles that you'd love to see that to get that treatment. So the kind of the transfer and the essays and the kind of alternative cover art and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. No, I have a few. And And a lot of them have been held up for like music rights reasons and stuff like that. Like Melody, I think Melody may have come out in the UK now, actually, like just recently. The one with Jack Wilde and like Mark Lester from Oliver. It's like the two kids from Oliver, and it's like this puppy love movie that was absolutely the inspiration for Moonrise Kingdom. And it was interesting that because that is a movie I love. It's about these two like 11-year-olds or whatever who meet at school and decide that they're going to run away and get married. And it's like the most adorable movie. And it's all like the soundtrack is Odessa era Bee Gees. So it's like, so it's like 1969 era, like Bee Gees music. So it's like kind of Baroque pop songs. And it's just like the most adorable movie. It's written by Alan Parker. And I think that, like it was a huge hit in Japan. So it was definitely, you could get it there, but I think it may have just come out in the UK in the last year or so, but it's like never come out in America. And those things still matter because we still have, even though people have multi-region players, we do still have territories for distribution. And so it, having never been released in America, still has value. Another one is The Touchables, which is a movie written by Donald Cammell and directed by Robert Freeman, who was like, he was like a Beatles photographer. He was mostly known as a photographer. I think he only made a couple of movies, but he made this movie called The Touchables that is, it's like these 4 women who live in a geodesic dome by a lake. So it's just like this clear dome with like a bed in the middle of it, and they like kidnap this rock star, this like male rock star, to make him into like their sex slave. And there's all this like weird like crime story happening in the background, but it also has the tone of like these late 60s like zany movies where like the humor is very absurd and there's like great music, and it just hits a lot of my like pleasure centers, this movie. And that's never been released. I'd love to see that get a release. Little Darlings is another one. I know none of these are horror movies, so it's like people are this is, but it's, my taste is kind of all over. But Little Darlings is a movie. It's like a summer camp movie with Christy McNichol and Tatum O'Neal from like 1980. That was a absolutely hugely influential movie to me, and that has never come out due to music rights issues also. But but there's certain things that have come out that were like my dream movies, like Toys Are Not for Children, I mentioned earlier. I was like destroyed that I didn't get to participate in that release. Arrow released it, and it seemed like they invited like every critic to work on that release except me. And I'm like a longtime fan of that. But I think that, I don't know. I'm trying to think of like what else. There's a million, but whenever people ask me for things like that, I just can never remember anything. So, but yeah, Melody, The Touchables, Little Darlings. Yeah.
That's great, thank you.
Okay, Natasha, you had a question? Oh no, sorry, it was Heather had your hand up, I think. Heather, if you, yeah.
So yeah, you touched on this a little bit already, but I just wanted to ask a bit more about your early experiences with film exhibition, more specifically, like whether you had any advice for someone like me on where's best to start as someone who's about to hopefully soon start putting on their own film events.
Well, I mean, I think the main thing, the hard part is always the venue. Like having a venue where you can have control over the kind of atmosphere that you want, that you want to set up. So it's like having a venue where you can control the sound infiltration. Like if it's a bar, which is where like a lot of people start, you do have like the idea of like people just coming in the door and like making noise and talking during the movie. And then, so if there's a way to not have that, and then also like, yeah, presentation has always been really important to me. So, and I feel like you can have no money and still have decent presentation. Like you can have, like when we had our little cinema, Blue Sunshine, the fact that we had masking, and it was homemade masking that we had to move with our hands, it wasn't automated or anything like that, but it made a massive difference. And we actually won an award in the local paper for like best presentation in Montreal, and that was compared to like the Cinémathèque Québécoise, which is like this multi-million-dollar institution that gets money from the government, and it's supposed to be like one of the main film presentation places in the country, and we won over them. And it was just like the newspaper people was like, they just try harder. They try harder. You know, it's like they don't have any money. They don't have all this fancy equipment that the Cinémathèque has, but it's clear they're trying to do really good presentation and it's important to them. And so I feel like that made a difference. You know, the fact that we weren't just hanging up a sheet, like a wrinkled sheet or something like that, and projecting the movies. We were like trying to make it as good as we could with whatever resources we had. And I don't know, I mean, I guess like just some of the, it's also a very different climate now compared to when I did it, you know? So I feel like especially if you're doing like genre programming, the press is so much more interested in stuff like that now, that, you know, I feel like you might have a much easier time getting press for those types of things than I did when I was starting out. But yeah, the other thing I would say is don't let it break your heart when people don't appreciate what you're doing. Like if your friends don't come to your screenings, you know, if you put on screenings and you're like, none of my friends even came, you can't take it personally, because the thing is, it's like putting on movies is your dream. It's not their dream, right? Like they don't owe you to go to your screenings, you know, so nobody does. Nobody owes you that. So you have to just like, it's your dream, it's yours. And if other people choose to spend their money on other things and not come to it, it's like, just don't let it break you, you know? That's, I think, one of the most important things. It took me a really long time to like not take it personally when people, especially my friends, did not come to ever come to my screening. You know?
That's great, thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry for the false start, Natasha. Do you have a question?
Hold on, let me just unmute myself. Yeah, so I've known a couple of young female film critics who have been deeply affected by depictions of abuse and mental illness in an exploitative and insincere light. And while they felt compelled to address the mishandling of these issues in films, they often felt hesitant to express their anger out of fear that their criticisms would not be taken seriously by a wider audience. And I was wondering, did you feel any trepidation when writing about your own personal history in The House of Psychotic Women?
I mean, I definitely felt trepidation. I feel more trepidation now. Like I feel more regret kind of now about like how personal I got with House of Psychotic Women. But it was, to me, it was the only way to do it, because I feel as though if I was gonna say, because I also knew that my opinions would not necessarily always be popular, and they don't always make logistical sense. They don't always make moral sense to people, you know, like why I would respond to certain types of imagery or anything. And so the only way I could defend my choices was to just get personal about it, you know, and just say like, well, I can relate to the things that this character is going through, or I can relate to the way that they're behaving because I have done those kinds of things, you know, or because I know other women who have done those kinds of things, and women who respond to trauma in different ways, women who respond to trauma in ways that, you know, I mean, it's like, it's the kind of conversation we're having all the time now when we're talking about people who, like, for example, bring up rape allegations 20 years after the fact or whatever, and people are like, well, she didn't bring it up before, so clearly it didn't bother her then, and it's like, no, that's not how trauma works. It's like trauma can get you at any time, you know, and it can get you in all kinds of weird ways, you know, like just the idea that and it was one of the things I think I talked about in my book, like especially in like the rape revenge chapter and stuff like that, like some of the weird behavior that comes after that would seem to indicate that they're actually having an opposite emotional response to something than they are, right? It's like for women to get very sexually promiscuous after having an assault like that, which is something that's fairly common. That would, you know, a lot of people would look at that and be like, well, clearly she was fine, you know, because she's, you know, going out and sleeping with people. And it's like, no, that's actually a trauma response, you know? So it's like, People respond to things in totally different ways, and things sneak up on people. And so I felt as though it's very hard to generalize about a lot of those things, because those things are just personal to people, you know? So I felt like the only way I could write that book was to be personal and be like, well, this is my perspective. Like, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, I don't have like some kind of background to be analyzing women all over the world, you know? So it's more like I'm looking at these movies and I'm looking at myself and seeing how and where these things correlate, you know? And so, yeah, I mean, but I had trepidation when I first sent it to my publisher, because I just assumed, and I was mentally preparing myself for everyone hating the book. I was positive that people were just going to make fun of me. I was positive that was going to be the response. And when that didn't happen, when people actually liked the book, I was shocked. Like, I couldn't believe it, because yeah, I mean, like, I had been made fun of at my own festival. You know, somebody wrote me a letter once about my Sin Muerte festival saying like, oh, you're gonna pick some more movies we can cry at the festival this year? We can all have a good cry. Because they knew that I tended to gravitate towards like really depressing and sad movies more than movies that had the traditional horror stings and stuff like that. And so I was like, well, that person, wherever that person's coming from, that person is going to hate this book, you know, because this book is all about like crying and everything, you know. But then also I had a bad situation recently where I had almost all good responses and constructive responses to it. I have had a couple of bad things where, you know, I had one, like a guy, a stranger, harassing me for about 6 months, like threatening me and stuff because of it. And that stopped rather suddenly. And I'm not totally sure why, but, and then also I had basically a relationship where the person had completely fabricated a personality to fit things like in the book. And it was like totally like a creepy, manipulative thing. Yeah, so I have had people now use it in negative ways against me. And so that makes you sort of scared to do that kind of thing again, you know? But I am glad that there are a lot of people who've responded to it and thought that it helped them figure out how they relate to movies kind of in similar ways, you know, like how the movies they choose and the kind of phases they go through in movie watching are like, oh yeah, that is actually reflective of like what I was going through at that time, why I was gravitating towards that kind of imagery or whatever. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. Actually, if I may follow up on that, I was wondering, there's quite a few films in recent years, such as Unsane, The Invisible Man, Swallow, feature women fighting against systematic abuse and gaslighting. And therefore, these films have been inextricably tied to the Me Too movement in their critical reception. I was wondering, what do you make of this? Are there limitations to how we discuss these narratives when we label them as part of a topical movement?
I definitely think so. And I mean, I definitely think so because it makes people sick of things, you know, like when things are, like, I mean, just for comparison, when I did the book Satanic Panic, which was about the satanic hysteria of the 1980s, you know, a lot of that began with cases or allegations of child sexual abuse in daycare centers and things. And the thing is, there was a kid that this case was kickstarted on that had been sexually abused by someone somewhere, right? And so it was like the daycare was brought in. It was like the people running the daycare were then accused of like having satanic rituals that they're trying to put all the kids in. They get the kids to confess to certain things through using weird coercive methods. And then by the end of the decade, they start thinking like, oh, this is such bullshit. All this satanic stuff is such bullshit. And people were like so sick of it that they just threw it out. Everybody was acquitted. They were just like, ugh, you know, we've spent 10 years dealing with this case and now we're sick of it. And the problem is that kid was still sexually molested and nobody knows who did it because everything got so like hysterical and so blown out of proportion and so focused on buzzwords and everything like that, that the real core of what had started that case, by the end of it, has been completely overlooked, you know? And I feel like that kind of thing, when people like just lump everything in with Me Too, it creates that, you know, people hit a certain, when it comes to like movements and terms that are, you know, terms of categorization and things like that, like people get saturated and exhausted by them, and then they stop engaging with them, you know, like they stop engaging with them in a really important or meaningful way. And I felt like after 6 months of the Me Too movement, it was already getting like that, where people were just like using it as a dismissive term, you know? So yeah, so I think it's like, if people just say like, oh yeah, it's a movie for the Me Too movement or something like that, which I may have actually said in the first like 6 months of it. I think I had to say a quote for a movie, and I think I did use a phrase like that. But I think that when people say that at this point, it's just easy. It's like an easy thing for them to say. They're not really like engaging with it.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Okay, I want to say Eleanor from Berlin Final Girls Film Festival, they screened Swallow earlier in the year actually. She's on Facebook, she said, we didn't just like the book, House of Psychotic Women, we loved it. And there's 3 exclamation marks on that comment. Just so you know. Okay, so
Swallow actually, by the way. So I'm like dying to see it, but I haven't seen it yet.
We actually managed to see it in Berlin. It was we didn't see all of it though. I should return to it. Anyway, Deborah, do you have a question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hello.
I like your face.
Yeah, no, I want to know what you'd like your legacy to be, and also if you're going to write a book now, which films would you do you think you'd draw on if you was doing another similar kind of memoir? And also, while I'm at it, have you ever had a supernatural experience? Sorry.
Okay. So first, what was the first question again? What would I like my legacy to be?
Yeah.
I would like my legacy to be that I never did anything halfway, you know, that I always went the extra mile with everything I did, and I just like didn't fuck around, you know. It's like, if I'm gonna do something, I'm like all in, you know.
Yeah, where do you get your courage from? Because you always like go in like fearless.
I don't know if it's courage as much as like stupidity or like ignorance about limitations, you know. Like I definitely feel like there are, once I've worked in a field or something for a long time, I'll be much more wary of like the kinds of problems that can come up, and I'll have baggage from having done other festivals where I'll be able to be like, no, I don't want to ever have Crispin Glover as a guest because he's insane, you know, or whatever. So it's like I learn things along the way, and so I definitely become like, so I'm not just like fearless about anything. Some things it's just more like, okay, that's too exasperating, I don't want to ever do that again. But in general, when I sort of plow ahead on things, often it's because I don't know enough of the obstacles yet to deter me. Mm-hmm. So it's not until I'm there that I'm like, oh, this is why people don't do this all the time, you know? So I think it's more just like ignorance of the actual problems that are gonna come up, you know?
Right, yeah.
And then the second question was, what was the second question? What
films do you think you'd draw upon now if you were going to do a memoir right now?
I mean,
new memoir.
Like if I had not written House of Psychotic Women and I was just writing my memoir for the first time now. Like
yeah, in the present.
I don't know. I hate men a lot more than I did when I read the last book. I feel like it would definitely be, you know, more. I feel like in the last book I was like very critical of women and very like kind of suspicious of women and very like obviously struggling with like trusting women and having to get all this stuff. And I feel now, I mean, especially because of that book, actually, my relationships with women have completely changed, you know, where I just feel like all these women have been so supportive of me and have a lot of the same issues. And once those issues were kind of aired, then the trust issues kind of melted away, you know, once it was like, oh, we're all going through this, you know. But I think now, like, I feel like it would be an angrier book now. I was talking to Natasha about that situation with this guy.
Yeah, what film do you think you would represent that?
God, it would probably be like 90s erotic thrillers or something, you know, where it's like The Stranger in My House or whatever, you know, just like,
yeah.
I mean, like, actually, like all, like, so much true crime TV is like all that stuff of like, or like Dirty John, you know, like that podcast, Dirty John,
Yeah.
where it's someone, where it's like, oh, this is actually not the person that I thought I was. And it was
terrifying.
like they targeted you.
Mm.
Because, you know, they targeted you, like, knowing things about you.
Yeah, that's scary.
Yeah, so that kind of stuff. Like,
The
person was not a dangerous person. It was like, it was just, but it was, yeah, he wasn't a dangerous person, but it was more just like playing a game until he was sick of it, and then it was just kind of like, but it wasn't a normal situation. I don't really want to get into it, but it was
horrible.
That was something where, like, my book had created this clear pathway to me, you know?
It's like somebody read your personal diary and then can use it to get to, you know, press a few buttons or whatever.
But that's the thing, like, when you write a memoir like that, it's weird because it's like when you go into a relationship, you go in, especially if the person has read that book, they go into the relationship already halfway there. Like, they already have they already, you know, all those conversations you have in the beginning where you're like, where did you grow up? Or what did you know, all the, like, they already know all that stuff, but you don't know anything about them.
So they fast forwarded
That's a
you.
really creepy dynamic that I didn't ever experience until I wrote this book, right?
Yeah.
So where this person totally new to you, you know nothing about them, you've never heard of them before, and they just know all this stuff about you. It's creepy.
Yeah.
But, and then the third question, have I ever had a supernatural experience? Not really. I mean, I've definitely had things where I feel like someone is touching me, or some pressure, or some, like, I can feel someone move behind me, like, or whatever, but I've never had anything where I've, like, seen anything or had anything, yeah, I've never, like, seen a ghost or anything like that. I mean, I definitely, like, I believe in all that stuff, so I, like,
yeah,
you know, but it hasn't happened yet.
Okay, that's a shame. Well, it might not be, but thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're getting quite close to the end. If anyone has a follow-up question, like, please give us a shout. But I wanted to double back just really quickly and ask you about, we kind of touched upon it before in terms of the films that you were frustrated not to be involved in their release. But can you maybe tell us how you feel about secret handshake movies and gatekeeping and this idea that some people have that they own a film, you know, and it's for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's weird because it's like, if somebody has devoted and I don't think I have a film like this, so I don't think I am one of those people necessarily, but I think there's definitely people who've, like, devoted so much of their work to, like, one movie or one filmmaker that they, you know, form obstacles to other people engaging with that artist's work, you know, from a critical perspective, you know. So it's like they you know, but at the same time, so it's like, yes, I get it, people can be territorial and sometimes it's stupid, but I also think that sometimes DVD producers are lazy and they don't go to the right person. Like, they don't look for the person who has devoted their life to that movie, and then, yes, that person gets annoyed when someone gets that job and it's an assignment to them, you know. Because, yeah, I mean, I have, like, a spreadsheet for, like, Severin films. I have a spreadsheet that I started that's just called experts, where it's like, anytime I come across expertise of any topic. It can be something minuscule, you know, but it'll be like whatever, Appalachian films or disembodied hands, you know, or witches or whatever. And it's like people who've like written books about this stuff, who've like written like multiple where you can see their academic record, where they've like been writing about this topic forever, you know. And it's like, well, I want to have diversity in the people that we approach to do the extras. And so and I do want to find the people who it's like, if people have devoted their life to, you know, like Godspell, you know, like this guy, Lee Gambin, I know, who's like a film programmer and a writer in Australia. It will be a crime if he does not get to do something on the Godspell release when that movie ever comes out, you know, because that guy is obsessed with that movie. And he's a writer, and he's, you know, he's involved with all these things. Like, so he's not just like a random fan, he's like also a critic and stuff. So, but it's the kind of thing where it's like, I just think like all you got to do is like look up online, you can Google things and people's articles will come up that they've, you know, you'll be able to see people's track records with certain movies and certain filmmakers. And so, yeah, I do think sometimes that you should be going to those people. But I also think that once that person has been on like 5 different releases and interviewed in every article or whatever, that you, at that point, you're just getting regurgitation, you know, like, and you do need fresh voices to come in and talk about those movies, you know.
Sure. And just a quick follow-up, is there any film that's so personal to you that you couldn't bear to share it with an audience of any kind?
Actually, I found that when I showed Born Innocent to an audience, I like broke down crying, and I was like embarrassed because I couldn't stop crying. And I felt like that movie is really personal to me because it's like set in a juvenile detention center, but it is so similar to the one that I was in that it's like hard to watch.
Okay, does anyone else have a question they want to ask just before Under the Wire? I have questions. I have so many questions. So go for another couple hours. So, but I want to make sure if you guys, I think someone on Facebook had asked if you had any surprises when you were working on the upcoming documentary. Any revelations to do with the genre that came up or have come up?
Yeah,
so far?
I mean, the biggest revelation that sort of like opened it up so much was that, you know, as I said, it started being about British folk horror, and that was going to be the focus. But it wasn't just going to be the focus because we were trying to keep it focused to that. It's just because so much of the literature, like the writing about folk horror and the culture around folk horror, like it's so visibly British, a lot of it, you know? And so when I was like, well, we should have a little thing on like American and, you know, blah, 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 all the other countries and like how it relates to that. And I kept thinking of it, you know, I went into it thinking that I was going to be looking at like how these other types of folk horror called back to the British type of folk horror or whatever, right? And people would talk about, I think even people I interviewed early on would be like, well, we don't really have a traditional folk horror in America and stuff, you know? And then once I started looking into, I started doing interviews and asking questions related more to American folk horror, and people having to think about it and be like, you know, and they'd be like, oh, well, I guess this movie might be folk horror or whatever. And then all of a sudden it was just like, bam, there was so much American folk horror. And not only was there so much of it, but because America is so big and because of the way that people colonized and settled America and the migratory patterns of how people moved throughout the United States, there were totally different branches of folk horror all over the country, depending where you were. And that there was so much about that. One of the main things that comes up again and again that's different from the British folk horror is that, you know, in British folk horror, often, you know, not always, but often the conflict is between the old pagan past and, you know, the modern, I guess, semi-Christian belief system or whatever. And the idea that this older civilization is still there and it's bubbling up, you know. And in American folk horror, it wasn't really pagans that were this problem. It was weird Christians. So it was like, it was Christians and other Christians that were considered heretical Christians or unorthodox Christians, or, you know, and a lot of that was like the ways that people moved out across the country and the different aspects of Christianity that formed, you know. And then that started connecting so much to Americans' fascination with cults, and the fact that so many villains in American horror look like Amish people, you know, like not, well, I can't say so many villains, but I mean like, but the Amish people definitely get a bad rap in horror because their attire will be used as like a signifier of like something sinister, you know.
Sure.
And it's because there's like conflation happening between, it's like fear of like Christian groups that like live in the country and like what are they doing out there, you know, or these small communities. So that was one thing that was like really different from the British folk horror, was all the different branches of Christianity and the little subsects and stuff like that, and how those would be the things that people would be kind of afraid of. And then you had like in the South, like the American South, like the impact of like the Haitian Revolution and like dealing with like hoodoo and voodoo and all these slave stories. I mean, it was like, oh my God, there's so much, like this is like its own movie, you know? So that was probably like the biggest surprise.
Okay, so I think that really is all we have time for. We have about a minute or so left. I'll do like very quickly lightning round. What are you working on at the minute besides the documentary? Do you know when we can expect that, by the way?
Well, I'm hoping to have it finished editing, and I'm hoping it'll be ready for September.
Okay.
That's my hope, yeah.
And you still have the Cockfighter monograph cooking?
Yeah, still working on that. I have like a bunch of stuff, all of which I'm kind of hoping will be done by September. So the Cockfighter book is one that I've been working on for many years. And that one is very personal to me. So I think that's part of why it's been taking a while, because it really needs to be perfect. And I also have a book that I've been editing for the Alamo Drafthouse about the history of their Weird Wednesday series and the American Genre Film Archive. And that one is almost done, so it's going to print soon. Great. And I have a book I've been co-editing on the films of Robert Downey Sr. And so that is in the middle stages of editing right now. And another book I've just started writing, co-authoring with another woman I know named Amy Searles, and it's about depictions of horror fandom in film and television. So like horror fan characters in movies. And yeah, I've also done a couple of like audio reading things, which I had never done before. It was like I sort of got asked to do these things by two different people. And so there's like a cassette coming out and a record, I guess, of me doing like spoken word with like a composer reading like a classic,
wow,
story. I can't say what they are though, because they haven't been announced or anything yet. But
okey-doke.
yeah, but so just like a bunch of stuff to keep me busy.
Great. Okay, well, and the best place to find that is on the publisher website, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the one that's probably the most mine, like, so Miskatonic is, I mean, it's my same address, I think, is listed on both of them anyway, but it's like, but yeah, the Miskatonic one, it's like the updates that go there are specifically about the classes and that's it, whereas like everything else tends to go on the Spectacular Optical website.
Okay, and that's where people can find it. Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us, and a huge thanks to Kier-La Janisse for staying with us for a couple hours to chat about film programming. It's been an absolute honor and a pleasure.
Yeah, nice to see everybody too.
And so we'll leave you just now, but hopefully speak again soon.
Okay. Thanks.
Bye-bye.